This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hi, my name is Scott Bellis. I played Max Fennig on The X-Files. And you're listening to the X-Cast.
Welcome back everyone to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and this week we're taking a look at the 18th episode of Season 4. The second part of a two-part episode, and this week it's Max. Last week it was Tempest Fugit. And Chris Knowles is back with me again. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Carl. Great to be here. Great to be with you and your listeners.
Yeah, great to talk to you as ever. And I know, this is... we were both big fans, weren't we, of Tempest Fugit? There's always kind of an open question, isn't there, with X-Files two-parters or three-parters, whether the concluding part's going to kind of stick the landing. But, well, we'll see what we think, because this is Max. It was aired on the 23rd of March, 1997, written by Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz, directed by Kim Manners, and this follows on directly from the last episode, so, Mulder and Scully continuing their investigation into the crashed plane. So, yeah, what do you reckon, Chris? I think you gave a perfect 10 to the first part, Tempest Fugit. Does this also get a 10? Does this one stick with landing?
Yeah, I think this is maybe a 10 plus, because this really raises the stakes. Like you said, there's such a reputation for X-Files two-parters to sort of drop the ball on the second part. And I always sort of figure maybe they spent all the money in the first part. Yeah, this, I think if anything, it ups the ante and it increases the tension, because halfway through it, we have that scene where we actually see what happened on flight 549. And, I would argue that scene was very much, highly influential on Lost. I think that you really get a sense that they were watching that quite closely. So, this is a terrific episode. I know people like Darren Mooney would probably argue with me, but I would probably, for two-parters, I would probably nominate this as the best mythology two-parter of the entire series. But, that's always subject to change with me, so.
We talked a bit last week, didn't we, about, the real virtues of it. It's so self-contained. I suppose the kind of counterpoint to that is it doesn't push things forward. So sometimes people want these big revelations in their mythology installments, I guess. And you don't really get that here, but what you do get is really taut and tense and exciting, I think, isn't it?
Well, a couple points. Last week we had discussed, my theories that this may have been an early treatment for the movie.
Yeah.
That's highly speculative on my part. But it just sort of comes across as being a movie within itself. And I know that in the UK, a lot of the two-parters and three-parters were sort of repackaged on VHS as movies. And a lot of times I don't think it really justifies that, that appellation. I don't think it sort of lives up to the, the feeling and the flow of a motion picture feature. This definitely does. And like I said, it's just so well written that within the first 10 minutes of Tempest Fugit, you really get the entire lay of the land and, as to what this series is about and, the relationships between the characters and whatnot. And, I really think that Max breaking, an unproud tradition, perhaps, really, really delivers and really, fulfills the promise of the first half.
Yeah, I'd probably be like an 8.5, 9 myself, but I really like it. And one of the things it manages pretty seamlessly, I think, from the first part to the second is the handover from Rob Bowman to Manners. But unless you were paying very close attention to the credits, you wouldn't necessarily know it from the on-screen action, I don't think. It feels very of a piece, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing that's really surprising, because if you watch enough X-Files, you really get the sense that those two directors have very different approaches. They focus on different things. Rob Bowman, to me, is much more of a widescreen kind of guy, and Kim Manners is sort of like the close-up guy, to put it simply.
Yeah.
that's obviously a gross simplification, but, if I was pressed to sort of boil it down to one sentence, that would kind of be my argument. But here, this flows so beautifully that there is absolutely no distinction between the two episodes for me at all, No,
absolutely, I agree. And I guess my one sentence may be like Bowman's the action guy and Manners is more the horror guy. It seemed like Manners was much more of that sensibility than Bowman, didn't it?
Well, after Bowman left in the 7th season, Kim Manners really became the primary mythology guy. So, it's really hard to say. I think that Kim Manners was so talented and so versatile and just almost holistic in his approach that, he could make that transition, pretty seamlessly. But, they spend so much time throughout the series sort of tag teaming on these two-parters that I think that, I know for a fact that they spent a lot of time studying each other's work and studying each other's approaches to, these episodes. So I think by this point, maybe a little later, but certainly by this point that, Kim Manners had really gotten a hold on how Rob Bowman approaches storytelling, problems, and I think that really pays off just in spades in this episode.
Just as we're talking about those two, and we've discussed the fact that there was the potential here, for a feature film plot and so on, and of course Bowman gets the gig on Fight the Future. Do you feel that was the correct decision? Do you feel like Manners was overlooked for the movie, or what?
No, I don't. I think that Kim Manners is much more like his canvas is more the television screen, and Bowman. You could argue the same with Bowman, since he didn't do much work in features, and he returned to the TV screen. He did a few features that really didn't go over very well. One of them was, a movie that I like very much because I was into the mythos, was the Elektra movie with Jennifer Garner, which is also, it was very X-Files because there were a lot of X-Files actors showing up, and, it was filmed in Vancouver and whatnot. I would not have chosen Kim Manners to direct a feature, simply not because I don't think he could have pulled it off, but simply because I just don't think that's where his primary interest was oriented towards. I think he was much more television guy,
Yeah.
And again, you can argue that of Bowman, but Bowman was sort of the aspiring movie guy, and it was after Paperclip that Chris Carter had phoned him up and said, I want you to do the movie. So.
Yeah, I still think it's a shame somebody like Bowman wasn't recruited back for the revival, Instead, we had all these kind of auteur pieces where they were written and directed by the same guy. But I think someone like Bowman, or I don't know, David Nutter's still around. Obviously, Manners had passed away. But I think especially season 10 missed some of those figures.
Oh, absolutely. But, I'm never a big fan of writers directing their own work unless, they're Stanley Kubrick or something.
Yeah.
Chris Carter, his visions are so idiosyncratic but I gotta say that, was it Kevin Hooks who directed Plus One?
Yep.
I think he really tapped in very keenly to the Chris Carter aesthetic. I think he really pulled it off, that he really sort of understood that sort of quirky, idiosyncratic approach that Chris Carter has. And, I thought he, did a fantastic job in translating that. But generally, yeah, I think that, what gave the season 10 revival such a disjointed and jarring kind of feel was just, there was no continuity of style. It just felt like 6 different episodes from 6 different TV shows that just happened to have, Mulder and Scully in it. For instance, Founder's Mutation to me just felt like it was like an episode of Fringe. It was like an episode of Fringe that sort of escaped into the, into the ether somehow, into some sort of cosmic time shift, and then ended up having Mulder and Scully starring in it. But the look and the feel of it was just not X-Files. And I really think the only episode that really had that kind of X-Files flavor was Home Again. But again, that, I think that the script was, not one of Glenn Morgan's finest, and it was just sort of 2 stories shoehorned into one. So, I think that, the guys want to sort of bolster their directors' credits or whatever. I'm not exactly sure, but I don't really think it worked well at all.
Anyway, back to Max, and it has exactly the same rating on IMDb as Tempest Fugit did, which is 8.6 out of 10, pretty high up for season 4. So yeah, I think a lot of people agree that this two-parter stacks up really well. So yeah, with that in mind, let's take a closer look at this episode. So the teaser's quite a brief one, isn't it? It's, Mulder being pursued by the frogmen, he swims to shore, tries to outrun the kind of commandos, but he can't, and he's apprehended. And again, different to some of these teasers you get in the other multi-part episodes, where often they introduce more elements that kind of complicate the narrative, like the white buffalo or whatever. But no, this one's much more streamlined and straightforward, I think.
Yes, smack dab into the action, which was, it's interesting. When I went back and rewatched it, rewatched it for, I don't know, the 50th, 60th time or whatever. It was kind of interesting, that it didn't follow that usual script, that usual X-Files script of, the second part, it throws in another story element in the teaser that, may or may not even play into that episode per se. So I think that, that's another reason why I really get the sense that this might have been a movie treatment. And again, I could be totally wrong. I do know the chronology that, Dave Gautier and the production team had built this set, but did they just build the set on their own? Like, let's spend, $700,000 building this plane crash set, because we just feel like it. And then, we'll see what Chris thinks. I don't think it went down like that. I think, Chris Carter and Frank and maybe some other people, maybe Howard Gordon or whatever, it sort of got together and thought this would be, they didn't know, what story they wanted to tell, but they just knew they wanted to do something like that. Yeah, I doubt that was Dave Gautier and his team's
kind of freelancing.
Yeah, just sort of like, moonlighting.
Well, yeah, because we're going to point out that line earlier that you mentioned last week. It's much later on, but it's not about this could be in a movie. It's about like try selling that to the movies or something, isn't it? The line. So yeah, I wonder. But in terms of this teaser, what I was thinking this time was it must have been miserable for David Duchovny, I think, because it looked like it was raining pretty hard and he's in this kind of wetsuit and he's trying to run down the coast or whatever. And I wonder if that was kind of a pleasant late night on set for him or what.
I doubt it, but I do believe that a lot of that work was done by a body double. David liked to really do a lot of his own stunts and whatnot, but apparently he had a great photo double in Vancouver. And, for instance, you can see it. If you really pay attention, you can see it. One of the things I'm thinking of is Endgame, like in the abortion clinic. Yeah. A lot of that work was actually the photo double. It wasn't actually David. So, and he actually had a good photo double in L.A. too, because he showed up in that one scene in Hungary. So,
is it Rob? Is it Kiziak? Is that his name?
Yeah, Steve Kiziak.
Steve Kiziak, that's right.
Yeah. David eventually had said that he thought this was he said it was it was like Vegas. You bring all the showgirls out and all the hardware, then you light them up good and you get entertainment. He said that like he really thought these were great episodes. Yeah. And I really agree. And again, I really appreciated that it didn't have like a bunch of scenes with like a bunch of old men growling at each other in a smoke-filled room, about things that may or may not pertain to the story itself. Again, I just think the Syndicate took a lot of the mystique out of the conspiracy.
Actually, the episode sidesteps a couple of the things you could sort of imagine it doing. And, when we're back with Scully in the bar, so Garrett escapes, Pendrell's clearly badly hurt, but she, is hoping he'll live, and her nose starts to bleed, but just before Skinner turns up. And I suppose the cancer arc at this point, it's not as directly addressed as in some of the other episodes like Elegy, for example. We get this thing here with the nosebleed, but even so, I think it still must be, informing Gillian Anderson's performance and the writers in other ways. So, perhaps that's why Mulder's decided to buy her a gift this year and stuff, but they don't really come out and say it. But I quite like the way it's kind of unspoken at times.
Yeah, I think that I think Gillian was definitely playing it with that in mind, because she's very kind of morose and philosophic, and like that whole speech at the end, and sort of like trying to like write her own elegy, as it were, or eulogy. I think that really, because you couldn't do an episode like Memento Mori and then just go back to the status quo, especially in a mythology oriented episode. You had to land back on that kind of home base and remind the viewers, what the stakes were, and that she's really not well and she shouldn't be doing any of this. So I think that, if you're paying attention, and, I think certainly at the time when, the cancer arc was such big news and like the fan press and whatnot, that, I think most viewers were definitely, cognizant of that and how that animated the drama.
Yeah. And of course, like Skinner comments on it, doesn't he? And I mean, Mitch Pileggi gets some juicy stuff in season 4, stuff with the smoking man in Memento Mori and, Zero Sum's not far away. I think it's probably fair to say the couple of scenes he gets here are a bit less demanding, but it's always good to see him, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because, the backdrop here is that, now he's under the, smoking man's thumb. So did he rat out, the sergeant there?
Frisch,
Yeah, Frisch. Did he rat him out? Did Scully let him know that, she's got, I think there's a bit of, they sort of want to leave that hanging, but they don't want to point attention to it, because if they point attention, they always wanted the fans to sort of draw their own conclusions and fill in the blanks on their own. But that was always my impression, that, like, how did anybody know that he was here? And I always felt like, well, Skinner ratted him out.
Mm.
And he ratted him, he didn't rat him out just because, he was being a punk. He ratted him out because he's trying to save, Scully's life,
Yeah, I'd forgotten actually that Frisch kind of disappears and it's left as kind of a loose end, isn't it? And, because he's put under arrest. Skinner talks about the military's come up with another explanation for the crash. I think, Scully outlines it in the following scene, doesn't she? Which is when she's with Mulder at the installation, and that's the scene where, they discuss the cover story. Mulder fills her in on what he saw at the lake. So there's a lot coming out. It's said that Sharon Graffia is not Max's sister. Also that Pendrell has died, in between scenes. So I think probably quite a shrewd choice. They didn't kind of milk all that for a bit more melodrama than they did. They actually, leave a lot of it off screen, and I thought that was good.
Yeah, well, that's sort of like the cold-heartedness, that they were really trying to go for here. But see, the thing is that to the viewers and to the fans, Pendrell was this like lovable character who had a crush on Scully and whatnot. To Scully, he was just like this guy who like worked in like some nerdy guy who worked in a lab. I mean, she probably, and I think the inference there is that she knew that, he had a crush on her, but, it's like she didn't even know his first name. So it's like she's not, he wasn't that, there was a lot of fan outrage at the time, and people were really upset that Pendrell was killed. I think it's interesting too, because it was Pendrell's death that, there was a certain quadrant of the fan base, sort of a very vocal quadrant of the fan base that, started to turn against Chris Carter and whatnot around this time. And it's interesting that I think that, I'm not saying that death, was definitely, the driver of that, but I think that was an impetus for certain parts of the fan base, because I think a lot of people sort of would identify with that character, a character who's sort of looking in at the X-Files from the outside and so on and so forth. But I think that, it's entirely appropriate. There's no reason to milk, from the point of view of Mulder and Scully, there's no reason like that they should be by his hospital bed holding his hand saying, hang in there, Pendrell, John, Fred, whatever his first name, it's like some, any other TV show would have milked that. And they were just like, well, that, it doesn't mean anything to them, it's that point of view storytelling. Again, the Scott Garrett character, what a great casting choice too. That actor just looks so evil, but evil in an interesting way, like not evil like, I don't know, Ted Bundy or something, just more evil, like almost like a bureaucratic kind of fashion. It always reminds me of like, somebody working in, room 101 in 1984, or, somebody working in a concentration camp or something. It's just like, this is my job. and I believe in what I'm doing because I believe it's in the greater good. And it's like, the most evil that has ever been committed in the world's history is always somebody justifying it for the greater good. It's like, that's always how real atrocity is inspired. Killing Penrill's kind of like killing a puppy, it's just this sort of little puppy dog character. I mean, he's very innocent and naive and has no idea what Mulder and Scully are really up to. I mean, even though, he was involved with the attempted assassination of Skinner. I wonder if Chris and Frank, and I think John Scheiben, were sort of looking at the real world of people involved in the kind of, ironically, I mean, because most people just think it's nonsense, but for the past 50 years at least, I mean, a lot of people have pointed out how many people involved in like UFO research meet violent ends or early deaths. I mean, it's something that's very real. And, people have been pointing it out for a long time. I mean, you probably might have heard most recently that a guy named Max Spires, who was a UFO researcher and actually vomited up like a black substance. He'd obviously been poisoned, but, people were sort of comparing it to the black oil and stuff like that. So I think that, part of it, again, there's so many things you have to weigh when you're producing a show like this. But I think part of it was just like they always wanted the onus to be on Mulder and Scully because that's what the fans really responded to. And then there's the whole issue of like, are we going to pay these people and, royalties and whatnot? And then I think it's also like, in the real world, people involved in intelligence work or UFO research or whatever you could say, I mean, often meet violent early deaths. So I think it's, perfectly appropriate in that regard.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us back to Max himself, because they go to his trailer, and there's a nice line here, I think, where Scully compares Max to Mulder, and she says, men with Spartan lives, simple in their creature comforts, if only to allow for the complexity of their passions. And I like whenever stuff like that is kind of raised, or comparisons are drawn with Mulder and some of these other figures, because it reminds you that, it kind of grounds Mulder in a way that, in reality, he'd be much more like Max, I think, somebody like Mulder, it feels like.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. And, it's easier to forget, that fact because, Duchovny is such an alpha male and he's so charming and confident and charismatic, his character really is supposed to be somebody who's a lot more marginal than that. So I think that's, very apt storytelling and whatnot. Even though they had known each other for such a little time, they only knew each other from their encounters in Fallen Angel. I think the obvious kind of takeaway here is that Max is seen by Mulder as maybe like almost like a little brother kind of character, that he's like, somebody who he really identifies with. And I think the scene with Mulder and the trailer park manager, I think, the way David plays that, I think that he really sells that whole emotion really strongly, I think.
Yeah, and also here maybe when he watches the tape of Max and you get a nice close-up of the Duchovny where Max is talking about wanting to be alone and stuff like that. And yeah, very poignant, I thought it was. Except the pace doesn't really let up because it, as we hear Max talk, it cuts to the like the cleanup operation at the lake, doesn't it? And the alien body being zipped away in a body bag, and Garrett talking about we found it and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a little bit of time for some sentimentality and then straight back to the action, isn't it?
Oh, that's such a great scene too, because that scene feels just so totally real. You have all these special forces guys, these covert guys probably working for some kind of like private military contractor and whatnot. And, they're like, oh, well, look at our buddies, just, not even our buddies, just guys we work with or whatever, getting radiation sickness and, going into convulsions on the beach. Yeah, I mean, that whole scene is so ruthless and so, I think, very real. Reminds me of like stories you hear coming out of Iraq or Afghanistan, with these same kind of characters,
And then, well, the next scene is possibly, I mean, I really like the scene in the hangar, which is, first of all, it's Mike Millar giving this kind of, I don't know, kind of an equivocal pep talk to his team. He's quite careful with how he phrases his summary and stuff. And then Mulder and Scully turn up. There's a great sequence that, isn't there, where Mulder gives his account of what happened aboard the plane. And obviously we see the action on board the plane too. And yeah, really well done. I find it completely gripping, even though, we know ultimately the plane must go down and stuff, but just seeing the reconstruction is, very intense, very involving.
Oh, I love it. And, one of the things I love is, when Mulder starts to preface, his little narrative and, says, intercepted by, an alien craft, and Mike Millar sort of turns around to Scully and she just sort of gives this like a little shrug that's like, oh, so classic. And just like, I love the way that, Gillian started playing, Scully is like very laconic around this time. There's a very similar scene in, Mind's Eye, these Scully reaction shots where she's like, just roll with it. It's just like, take it from me. This is the best you're going to get. So I think that cause that takes us into the whole, the great set piece of this whole episode, that whole, crash scene, which is really, I think that it was just a masterpiece and such an incredible accomplishment of logistics, and being able to pull that off on a television schedule is just unbelievably amazing. It's just, when you read about, there were extras who could only, they were like trying to hang in there as best they could, but they had to bail out because they were getting sick, because that thing was just like rocking, it was like so violent. And, like the film crew had to wear helmets, like elbow pads and stuff, because, like they would just be taking tumbles and everything. And it's just like such an amazing, I think an amazing bit of storytelling. And, one of the things I really love about these episodes too is that, they bring, Scott Bellis back as Max Fennig, but they don't do it in a way, that other series would do, where it's, very kind of like melodramatic or sentimental, or, it's like you see so little of him, and all you're really getting a sense of his story is, that the teaser in the first episode and this sort of flashback, that's part of Mulder's sort of narrative of what really happened with, Flight 549. And then these home videos where he's sort of telling his story. And it always kind of in a way, it's in a strange way, it kind of reminds me of, Apocalypse Now, because Apocalypse Now, Marlon Brando is really only in that film for like less than 10 minutes, Yeah. But the whole arc of the story is, this trip up the river, and it's, it's all in anticipation of encountering this character. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. And I think in this sense that, like, there were actually complaints. I mean, a lot of people were saying, like, why did you bring this character back, only to give him such little screen time? And my argument would be is like, the screen time that we see of him is unbelievably memorable. I mean, if he was like sitting around the office, the X-Files, whatever, however any other television program would treat that. I love the way that they break convention. And, it's so easy to forget, but, I think part of the mystique and part of the appeal of the X-Files, particularly in those first 5 seasons, you never know what was going to happen. The show was always going to bank left when every show would just sort of, bear right. I mean, it was always a surprise, it was always confounding your expectations. And I think that the way that this episode does so, I think it adds just to the power and to the, to the impact that it had. And I think that if it's not as highly regarded, through the active fan community, I think that's just more a statement of like the particular interests and focus of the active fan community that isn't really so much on like, this greater story that the X-Files is trying to tell. Because in that context, this episode is, I think, I wouldn't necessarily say it's crucial because, like you said, it doesn't necessarily advance the storyline. But I think what it does is that after the mythology was it was almost becoming like like the way the mythology was going from Talitha-Kumi to, and even to be fair, I mean, once the sort of the black oil is introduced, it just became more and more overtly sci-fi, and sci-fi in a way that I think maybe was starting to feel a little too familiar. And I think what is so great about this episode, and even in a way, with Memento Mori too, which is very much sort of harking back to Colony and Endgame, that this particular two-parter, grounds the mythology again. It puts it back on terra firma. There's no black oil, there's no shapeshifters, there's no syndicate. This is how this works in the real world. And I think that makes it so much more impactful.
In terms of the flight, I'd forgotten how harrowing it was when, bodies start flying out the side of the craft and all that stuff,
Yeah.
But, great sequence, really is. I mean, we get some stuff. Mulder talks a bit about the object Max must have been carrying, kind of the MacGuffin of this story. We don't find out a huge amount about it. We know it divides into 3 parts, somewhat arbitrarily, but the specifics are not too important, I think, in a story like this. But there's also that line you mentioned last week, which we've already kind of alluded to. Maybe you can sell it to the movies. But even before that, there's a reference, isn't there, to tractor beams being a Hollywood term. So, yeah, maybe these things are speaking to what you said earlier about this being the movie treatment or whatnot.
Yeah, I think in a better world, this would have been the movie. But, again, it's sort of like Hollywood has its own agenda and its own way of doing business. And they probably, if in fact this was pitched as a treatment for a feature film, it just, it didn't seem grand enough. And, but I really think that what made the X-Files so appealing for people was the mystery, and mysteries are always more alluring than, their solutions. And I think, one of the things that really, there are a lot of things I don't like about the feature movie, but, it's just sort of like everything is spelled out. And, I love John Neville. I love his character. And, that scene with he and Mulder in the limousine is as good as it can possibly be, at the same time being like letting the air out of the tires. Because the appeal of the show, it's twofold. It's intimacy and mystery. And it's a kind of storytelling, the appeal of the storytelling was that it just sucked the viewer in. And when you have this very conventional kind of popcorn feature, and then that launches into the season where, the 6th season where it's very front loaded with stunt casting and novelty episodes, I think it kind of broke that trust. And I don't think that I don't think the show ever fully regained that kind of, that equilibrium that it once had in balancing, mystery and intimacy. And, much to its, disadvantage. But, here, not knowing, again, it's like when something like that shows up, it's like, what is this thing? Why is it so important? Like, why is Max willing to die for this? Why are all these people willing to kill for it? It's like, we don't know what it is. And I think not knowing what it is, it adds to that air of mystery. And, that I think what the writers were doing, specifically Chris and Frank with mythology in the earlier seasons, was just trying to keep you on like this constant state of uncertainty and constant state of like, your head spinning, because they want to put you in the shoes of these characters. These characters wouldn't be able to explain everything. They're coming across all these things that, seem to fly out of nowhere and have no explanation. So by not doing that omnipotent narrator kind of deal where, you find out exactly what this thing is and where it came from and blah, 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 which would never be as interesting as the mystery, that it really preserves that, that power and the mystique.
Yeah, and in terms of like the characters here, Mike Millar, obviously, he exits, but before he does, he kind of says, look, I can't write this up. And again, so the end of his involvement, it kind of sidesteps some obvious dramatic things they could have done with him, but in a way that rings very true, I think. And you sort of see what Mulder and Scully are up against, don't you? If on the one hand, you got people like Garrett who are kind of true believers, but on the other side, you got someone like Mike Millar who's very capable, highly intelligent, but it's just harder for people like him to kind of sign up to their outlook and worldview, isn't it? And you can understand why, I think.
Well, here's the thing. It's kind of and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a very interesting perspective on this. Scott Garrett has been read in. He knows the drill. He knows what's going on. He knows the stakes. But that knowledge has made him a monster.
Yeah.
Mike Millar goes from being like, get the hell out of here. What's the matter with you? This is a serious investigation, to like standing in the middle of a swamp, underneath the, spotlight of a triangle UFO. So, and then having this woman just sort of like, beam down out of nowhere. So, I mean, I think with Mike Millar, it's like, it's an interesting kind of thing because, when an FBI agent shows up, you see how Mike Millar is like, takes him seriously. It's, this is the FBI. I mean, they must know what they're talking about. And then he's just like, what? What the hell are you talking about? But then he's just like, oh, okay. Well, that FBI agent knows what he's talking about. And maybe just like, this is just being covered up by everyone else. So it's like he is initiated, like he's initiated into this mystery. But he realizes that he's absolutely powerless to do anything about it. Scott Garrett has already been, initiated into this mystery for a very long time. And that turns him into like, a monster. And it's almost like Scott Garrett is almost, because we had the death of X, at the beginning of the season, and Scott Garrett is sort of like, he's sort of filling the role that an X would, but he has no conscience. X's tragic downfall is that he had a conscience. He had morality. This other character seems to be entirely willing to forsake any kind of ethics or morality in sort of almost like a sort of situational ethics. Well, this is wrong, but in this case, it's right. So that kind of deal.
And I mean, we get a couple more scenes that kind of put the pieces in place for this episode's kind of end game, because we get Mulder revisits Max's trailer. You mentioned the landlord already. He brings in the mail. So Mulder finds the luggage claim thing, and Scully also visits Sharon Graffia. We learn a bit more about her, don't we? That she's like an aerospace engineer or something, I think they say, and that she stole the alien object. She knows where the third piece is. So yeah, everything's kind of ready then, isn't it, for the denouement, as it were. And that all takes place, well, firstly at the airport, Mulder retrieving Max's bag. He's being tailed, but he manages to stay ahead of people and speaks with Scully a bit on the phone. And then that brilliant scene on the plane, namely the discussion between Mulder and Garrett. And, Mulder's on to him straight away, isn't he, because he sees the leg wound. But it's what you were just speaking about. It's, Garrett saying, a man, if he's any man at all, knows he must be ready to sacrifice himself to that which is greater than he. So yeah, great insight into his mindset. It's the kind of outlook you'd associate with like terrorists almost, isn't it really? And it makes me wonder how much he knows. Like you said, he must have been clued up to a certain extent. How many other people involved with a conspiracy are kind of zealots like he apparently is as well, because you kind of think like in James Bond movies or something, you get all the people running around in like volcanoes and stuff, and you wonder how much they actually know. But someone like Garrett, you can see that, he's a believer in the cause.
Well, yeah, because so early on in the writing process, Chris Carter had assigned John Shiban to sort of write Garrett's dialogue in that scene.
Yeah.
And what Shiban had gone is there was a scene with Joseph Cotton in The Third Man, and talks. These two characters are on top of a Ferris wheel, and they're looking down, and it's like look at those dots down there. If one of them stopped moving, would you even notice? And I think it's even more chilling here, because Garrett, how many, so many people are expendable to him. So many of those lights could just be shut off because, there's this greater mission in mind. And it's like what Well Manicured Men says in the feature film. It's like survival is the ultimate ideology. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what Garrett's exact motivations were, but it's clear that he's read in. He's not just some sort of flunky or functionary. Mm-hmm. He's somebody much higher than that. David's acting is just brilliant. I mean, just sort of that very insinuating way, he's like, I'm going to shoot you. I don't care what happens. It's like, I know that you're evil and, you killed somebody who was important to my partner and I have no compunctions about killing you because that's where I am at this stage in my, my journey, that I will shoot somebody on a plane and not care. So it's almost like in one regard, it's like, Garrett is as much of a true believer as Mulder. Yeah. It's almost like, because Mulder is, he's obviously much more emotionally engaged than Garrett here. But at the same time, it's like, would Mulder be willing to down another airliner if it meant like taking, he's got his hands on somebody who's obviously a little bit higher up in the hierarchy than, I don't know, just like someone like Krychek even, so would he be willing to sacrifice a lot? And, to me, the inference is that he clearly would be, because he's just like, well, Scully's dying, so what do I have to live for anyway? And again, that whole subplot with the Scully cancer informs so much of this. And it's hard to go back and watch these on DVD without remembering, how this season was unfolding. When Scully had cancer, everybody was like, oh my God, what the hell are they doing? And it's like, it's an inoperable cancer. Is she leaving the show? Are they writing her off? There was a lot of, speculation about that. And I think that, it's hard to go back in time when you know how the series is unfolded, how the fifth season turned out, and the feature film and so on and so forth, and forget just how, first of all, how like just emotionally involved so much of the viewership was in the way the story is unfolding. And second of all, like the way they were just dropping all these bombs on you. It's just really shocking. But the other thing I wanted to mention, when you get back to like sort of the real world, the way the X-Files was capturing the zeitgeist, is that, when this episode aired, we're sort of coming up onto the anniversary in the summertime of the Roswell incident. And there was a lot of talk. There was actually a television special that Stacy Keach, of all people, had narrated, and it was just basically talking that, all this technology that you're enjoying now all came from the Roswell crash, and that's why, everything just sort of change overnight, going from, tubes to transistors to microprocessors that, computers that are more powerful than computers that were the size of a house and during World War II, but now they can fit into a pen,
Yeah.
So I that's another thing that you really have to keep in mind there, is that was very much in the air. And it wasn't just like sort of like in like Usenet alt conspiracy threads. It was like, it was starting to leach into the mainstream, the people were talking about that. And then actually there was a lieutenant colonel who had actually been very high up in the national security establishment, who wrote a book called The Day After Roswell, it was very controversial, but, he had argued that, transistors and microprocessors and stealth technology and Kevlar and all these kind of things all came, from the materials they had recovered at Roswell. So, again, it was very controversial, and a lot of people just didn't believe it on the face of it. But that, I think, is driving this. It's like, is this thing that Sharon Graffi got her hands on, was this alien technology, or was it something recovered from Roswell? It was very much in the air, and I think it really animated the story to a degree that's hard to appreciate today.
I think you're definitely right. It's like, it is hard to go back, isn't it? And, recall exactly how things were back then, especially when you've seen the later series and how they kind of transform the earlier storylines and so on. But, here, there has to be kind of a reset of sorts, and, the action comes when Mulder, speaking to Scully on the phone, he notices that his watch has stopped, and, he cottons on that the plane's about to be intercepted. There's a confrontation with Garrett, all the turbulence, and then a bright light that kind of envelops the cabin. What do you make of all this as the kind of concluding action or whatnot here? It kind of... They have to be kind of passive to an extent, I suppose, these characters, don't they, when you're dealing with forces, alien forces, I guess?
Well, yeah, and I love that, too. I love the fact that, I've always said that I love the fact that how often Mulder says, I don't know. When somebody goes, you're Mulder, you should know. And he's like, I don't know. And it's like, I'm going to, that really draws the viewer into the action, because you're going to try and solve the mystery with him.
Yeah.
I love that scene. I love that, I love that. I love this entire two-parter to death. And I just think it's amazing. It's so funny. This is like, there are these little moments in the X-Files that I sort of focus on that so many other people would just think were like nuts. But one of the things that makes that whole sequence so realistic to me is, the plane lands and then you see Mulder. You see Skinner and a bunch of FBI agents sort of running down, the tunnel, whatever those things are called.
Yeah.
They hook up to the planes, those exit ramps, whatever. But, so you see these guys sort of running down, and then you see this woman who's like sort of in like a suit, and high heels, and she's running down, and she's obviously not, incredibly comfortable. But I mean, I love that. I mean, I love the fact that it just, that scene gives it so much more of an air of realism to me, because it put, again, it's like people know what it's like to go down one of those tunnels into the plains. So, I mean, it just makes it so much more real to me. And the fact that, Gary just disappears, and Mulder doesn't remember what happened, but he looks at his watch and sees 9 minutes is missing, and so on and so forth. And he he does the math in his head, pretty quickly, and just realizes, the guy who was nabbed. He was holding on to the, whatever that piece of equipment was. And then they wanted it back. The aliens wanted it back, and they grabbed him and the equipment. But, again, I also get the sense that the producers were thinking, okay, this guy is good. This actor is good. This is a good character. Let's not kill him off. I think they shouldn't have done, maybe shouldn't have done with Max, but again, it wouldn't have that poignancy if Max had survived. And it's interesting too, because there's a sort of a parallelism here, because, we have these, Mulder loses, Max, somebody who he briefly knew, but had sort of like this, almost like a fraternal or even paternal relationship towards, there, but for the grace of God go I kind of attitude towards. And then you had, Scully, with her little puppy dog crush boy.
Yeah.
And they both sort of meet ignoble ends, you could argue that Pendrell goes out a hero, but it's like he wasn't intending to get shot. He's just walked into the path of a bullet. Yeah. And and again, it's just that kind of resistance to milking melodrama that made, specifically the Vancouver X-Files so great. I think that there was a tendency in the later episodes of the LA era to get a little bit more television, to get a bit more soapy, to get a little bit more melodramatic. As much as I love that stuff at the time, going back and trying to rewatch that, it feels a little off, but, there was sort of a directive behind that, because it's like, you can't just milk that same beat over and over again. You have to, the way that people were engaging with these characters, they had really no choice but to delve deeper into their emotional lives. And I think that Kim Manners was very much a driving force in this, because, he's a very emotional guy, very, emotionally driven and emotionally driven as an artist. Glenn Morgan recounted the story, and I forget the exact episode it was, but, Kim Manners was watching a playback of a scene that he had shot, and he was like in tears, and I think that that kind of, that very volatile emotionalism that Kim really brought to the table, which in many ways, turned up the heat in some ways, but in some ways, I think made it a bit more television than it had been in the Vancouver era. So, I mean, take what it's worth,
Yeah, well, especially, like you say, the LA years, and especially season 9, I guess, with a lot of the stuff with the baby, and, Gillian Anderson can do all that stuff, of course, but it just gets exhausting for the viewer, doesn't it? When you're seeing, fairly similar scenes again and again where she's kind of distraught and whatever. So, I think that's a very fair point, to be honest, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, because, like I said, towards the end run of the Vancouver era, she sort of lapsed into a very kind of laconic, very controlled, very emotionally sterile kind of character. And that wasn't because, she just wasn't emotionally engaged. It was because she was too emotionally engaged and sort of had to shut down. And I think one of the great examples of this is, of course, my all-time favorite X-Files episode, Christmas Carol. You really get a sense of like how much her work on the X-Files had kind of changed her and kind of, I think, deeply damaged her. And, and that's a great example of how, much attention they were paying to her arc, to her development, how her character responds. Because, go back and watch like any, particularly first half of the season, the first season episode. And she's just this like knee-jerk skeptic, and she's really kind of a brat. And, she's just like, she's just almost like a foil. And then, she's abducted, and then she's drawn deeper into the whole conspiracy, and that whole scene in 731 when she meets with the first elder, and that whole thing. It's like, I know pretty much everything about you, and that's like, how can that not chill you? You know what I mean? Especially back then. Like, how can you not just be shocked by that? Like, having some guy who you've never met, you've never seen, you have no idea who he is at all. All you know is that he's had like all these people killed, and they're all thrown into mass graves, and he's telling you he knows everything about you. Like, how does that not traumatize you? You know what I'm saying? So yeah. I think in a lot of ways, by the 5th season that Scully is really a character who's been traumatized, and I don't think that's really appreciated, by the fans. I love that scene in The Red and the Black when she's, first of all, that entire scene when she's being hypnotized, yeah. It's got to be one of the greatest scenes, not only in the history of the series, but in the history of television. It's just astonishing. But when she's like reaching out her hand, for Mulder's, it's just like, like it's that one little touch. Because it really just goes to show you that, like, she's not Wonder Woman. Like there's such this sense today that the female characters have to be like perfect and unassailable. The whole like Mary Sue kind of impulse that has become so prevalent. And it's just like, characters are human beings. If they're not human, if they're not vulnerable, if they're not traumatized by trauma, then they're not interesting. Then because they're not real, they're just fantasy characters. They're just fantasy projections of the writer's inadequacies. Really, the whole situation with the X-Files is that she isn't just facing like it's clearly got all those elements of police procedural. On the surface, but it's really about the apocalypse. It's about it's about everyone on Earth being killed by some invading alien force that's being collaborated with by a bunch of like extremely powerful and ruthless men. It's like, what human person of any strength, or whatever, would not be affected by that, would not be traumatized by that. So in order, for not to be, and also, when I know there were a lot of complaints when she became a mother and everything like that. And I do think in the 9th season that it just like got to be like, oh, can we just stop playing this beat already? We get it, And that's why I love like in Providence when she's like kicking ass, and she's like kicking ass and she's telling off the FBI, senior management, but she's not doing so in a way like a way that you would see now that's like silly and obviously contrived and fantastic. She's doing so in I think what I would judge to be a very realistic context of a woman who's just had enough. She's had enough of this crap. You know what I mean? She's had enough of the FBI constantly lying to her. She's had enough of people trying to hurt her family. You know what I mean? And I would just point to that as sort of being like the great exception to that, oh, my baby beat that they just kept playing, throughout that 9th season that I just think was, it did get kind of tiresome.
Yeah. So just back to like the end of this one. So we got a nice scene, don't we, with Sharon Graffia again. See Max one last time on the video, and then that scene where Mulder and Scully talk, the nod to Pendrell, not knowing his name and that kind of thing. Yeah, also Scully talking about the keychain, and looking up into the sky as she does so. And Mulder, of course, kind of punctures the seriousness of the moment at the end, doesn't he? He says, I just thought it was a pretty cool keychain. But in the first part, he was about to talk about what it represented to him before Sharon turned up. So why do you think he acts like he does here? Do you think he was just feeling it was getting a bit too heavy and he was getting a bit uncomfortable?
Well, yeah, I think that's part of it. Because the subtext of her speech there is that she's dying and she's just sort of reflecting on, she's waxing philosophic, and Mulder doesn't want to, I don't think he's being insensitive, but he just doesn't want to, get lost in that, you know what I mean? Because it's just too painful for him. We never do really find out what that Apollo chicane's all about. But, one thing that I would bring up again in the context of, the real world zeitgeist that the X-Files was tapping into was that, the whole Apollo 11 hoax conspiracy stuff was really rising to prominence that era. Like in the 4th season, there was a film called, It Was Just a Paper Moon, by a guy named James Collier, again, who died, shortly after making the film, and he wasn't that old. That really started to seep into the public consciousness at that time. And of course, Mitch Pileggi did that, Fox special, a couple years later. So, I mean, again, it's the X-Files really drawing on, what's going on in the, sort of the conspiracy underground and parapolitical and paranormal and UFO. They're really pulling their stories out of, what's going on. And again, like this whole thing where this whole thing with the flight, with Flight 549 really tying into what happened with TWA Flight 800, being downed or crashing or somehow. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about that. Again, I had mentioned that there was a lot of theories that it had been downed by an errant anti-aircraft missile that was shot from a battleship, a Navy battleship off the coasts, a ways, and there was a cover up because it was a mistake and it wasn't supposed to happen, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really the it's why Apollo 11. It doesn't make any sense. It's kind of silly, but I think it's just sort of like maybe this sort of sly insinuation that there's a cover up and there's a hoax and there's a conspiracy and all that sort of, because both, the whole deal with Flight TWA, Flight 800, and then the whole thing with the Apollo 11 stuff. And of course, the Apollo 11 stuff we see pretty explicitly in the what was it, the teaser for My Startle 3. So, it's almost like sort of bringing that full circle. But again, I like the fact that it's never explained, and I like the fact that it's never really touched upon, and again, the mystery is always more alluring than the solution,
Yeah, do we see that keychain again? Do we see it in season 8 Alone? Yeah, that's right. So it does get another look in. Yeah,
it's regifted.
That's
right.
right.
I want to mention too is that Tempest Fugit had aired just a few days after what was called the Phoenix Lights, and the Phoenix Lights was actually huge. I mean, there's actually been a number of documentaries made about it. I think one of them is called Out of the Blue, but the Phoenix Lights were that there were these huge aircraft, like they said it was like the size of a football field, sort of hovering over, the metropolitan area of Phoenix and I believe Tempe and just that sort of area. And that happened just a few days before Tempest Fugit airs. And, boy, talk about tapping into the zeitgeist, you couldn't ask for anything better. But also, one of the things I wanted to bring up, especially in light of the arc of the season, is that, when this episode Max aired is when the Heaven's Gate suicides began. I wonder if they waited to watch the episode of the X-Files and then said, okay, well, that was fun. Let's wait for that whole Hale-Bopp comet and the spaceship falling behind it and all this kind of stuff. But ironically, they're waiting for a giant spaceship, and there's a giant spaceship like literally right down the highway in Phoenix at the same time being reported. And it was a really big story here. I mean, over in the UK, you're not as aware of it. But so the Heaven's Gate suicides start the night of this episode being aired, which I find sort of being, very interesting timing as well. And also because the suicides were very similar in many ways to what we saw in The Field Where I Died with the Temple of Seven Stars, which is just, a few episodes backing up in this season. And one of the things that I had mentioned when I was talking to Darren at Red Museum was that the Heaven's Gate cult and the suicides were ultimately inspired by Red Museum, because there was this whole thing. I mean, I believe that the cult in Red Museum was based on another cult that was committing suicide literally around the same time called the Solar Temple. It was a cult based in France and in Quebec. But they had sort of seen themselves that they weren't really human. They were from the star system Sirius, and they were going to escape their bodies and sort of travel astrally. So when Chris Carter's making reference to that in Red Museum, like literally the Heaven's Gate cult watched that episode and thought they were, Chris Carter was writing about them, that this was all a message to them, that it was time to, start to prepare to leave their bodies, because they were just walk-ins. Any X-Files fan is familiar with that concept, that they were walk-ins, that they were just alien spirits in human bodies, and it was getting time to leave. And they saw the Red Museum episode as a signal that it was time to get ready. And I don't know, what their reaction might have been to The Field Where I Died, but probably they saw that as another sign, because it was very much analogous to what they had ultimately committed the night this episode aired. So it's really that people. I don't know how old you are. How old are you? What year were you born?
I was born in 86.
Okay, so you were pretty young at this time. You were in the UK, so I mean, a lot of this kind of stuff might not be familiar to you, but these were all huge, huge, huge news stories over here. And the fact that this was all going on, we had the Roswell report that the Air Force released, and everybody just thought it was a hoax and a cover-up because they're claiming that the bodies that people reported were crash test dummies, but crash test dummies weren't invented until the early 50s, and this took place in 1947, and so on and so forth. So it's like, this was the time when the X-Files, more than I think than any other time, was just not only tapped into the zeitgeist, but it was also driving it. You know what I mean? It was like this synergy between what was going on in the world, particularly in this whole parapolitical underground, which was really bubbling up to the surface at the time, and the show. I think that it would have profound implications for the culture in the years to come.
Yeah, and in terms of that connection then between like artists and their audiences, I mean, someone like Chris Carter, he writes his episode or whatever. I mean, you could apply this to any artistic endeavor, I think. He tries to imbue it with certain meanings, but then once it's out there, people can do what they want with it, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's in line with what Carter intends, and on occasions like you've cited there, perhaps not. It can be a very, what am I trying to say, like a fraught kind of relationship between an artist and an audience, can't it?
Yeah, well, I personally speaking, I always think it's generally a good idea not to act in the real world on things you see on science fiction television programs, and that's just me personally. I think it's generally a good thing not to take it too seriously and start playing it out. But oddly enough, I mean, I blogged about this. There was a guy in Idaho who not only was playing out 3 words from the 8th season because he had information on this alien takeover. In this case, they were Martians that were taking over the world, and he had put it in a knapsack and thrown it over the White House lawn. So, I mean, and then he had shot his pastor because he said his pastor, and the church elders were all shape-shifting aliens, who were sexually preying on humans and so on and so forth. And then he actually shot the guy 6 times in the torso, and the guy survived. And he said, "See, that's proof that he's an alien," and so on and so forth. And he had written this big manifesto. And the thing that was so, sort of unsettling about this manifesto was that the guy was clearly not delusional. He's not like a disordered mind. He sort of spelled out, very exactly why he believed this was happening. I mean, maybe that's like, a high functioning psychotic in this case. But, again, that's another example of the X-Files being acted out. But this was like back in 2016. So this isn't even like, when the show is hot. I guess it's during like in the aftermath of the show's revival. But yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of this, where the show is tapping into what's going on in the world, and then the world starts tapping into the show. I mean, I have this whole running theme on the blog about what I call X-Files reality, and it's just astonishing how many plot points that you saw 20 years ago in the X-Files and now, headline news on all the science sites. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Pretty disturbing in many ways, I think. All right, let me just run through a few listener comments before we go. And like lots of people, really into this one. It seemed like quite a few people said they'd grown to appreciate this 2-parter more over the years. So Malcolm Krang said, fantastic set pieces and production values. The runway chase and scuba diving scene certainly stand out as highlights, along with Joe Spano's fantastic performance. I always love the juxtaposition of Max's paranoid monologue set against the recovery of the alien bodies. For a long time, I was bothered by the fact that this 2-parter contributed basically nothing to the ongoing mythology arc, but in hindsight, it makes the 2-parter self-contained and far more approachable. And I think I'd echo that. I think that seems to be what a lot of people feel, but perhaps.
I mean, can you really say it contributed nothing to the ongoing? I think it contributed a lot because, like I said, it grounded the whole thing back in the real world. I think I think this episode, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how conscious they were of this, but I think it really set the stage for what we saw in Gethsemane. You know what I'm saying? Because Mulder had already, he'd been under the water and he'd seen the crash ship and he'd seen the alien body. And I think, that whole arc, even though I think it's fantastically contrived and I think a very poor creative choice in many ways, but it kind of sets up the stage. I mean, I would argue that the second half of the season, all sorts of, it's all like of a piece. It's all, even the standalones and the monsters of the week are all playing into the arc of the overarching mythology. And they'd kind of done the same thing in the second half of the third season. And I think that, it's just really brilliantly played how they did that. And so I would not say that this doesn't contribute anything to mythology. I think it contributes a lot. I really do.
In terms of the characters, yeah, I guess what people mean is we don't learn any more about the plans for colonization. I guess information, I suppose, is what people would say is lacking, I guess. But no, that's a fair point, I think. Let me quickly take out a point from what Robert Buckles said. He says, I think one of the most cringeworthy this show happened in the 90s moments of the entire run is when Mulder has the line about more people wanting the alien technology than a Tickle Me Elmo doll. And yeah, that kind of jumped out at me. It's like, I think that the series is so timeless in so many ways, but occasionally there are these things that jump out that kind of really root it to a certain time. And I guess Mulder referring to the Spice Girls in Triangle and stuff like that. But I mean, that's to be expected. But if somebody's watching the series in 50 years, they'll need a kind of a footnote on stuff like that, I guess,
Well, those are all David's ad-libs. He ad-libbed a lot. And a lot of great lines that, people sort of assumed were his in the writing and the scripts. He had ad-libbed. And I think that gave, it lightened this, it's sort of like that salty and sweet kind of thing where the salt brings out the sugar and the sugar brings out the salt. I think that, again, it's a zeitgeist, because people are going to understand that reference in 1997. They may not understand it now, but it's like, yeah, I mean, it took place in a certain point in time. It's, it's not meant to be eternal. It's not meant to be told at any point in time and still be applicable,
Yeah, absolutely. But no, Robert really liked the episode. He says, though, the keychain is a horrible gift, no matter how Scully attached meaning to it, especially for someone who could have been having their last birthday. Caredwen Foley said, I love this two-parter and it has only become more impressive to me over time. The sets are extraordinary. It feels simultaneously huge and mythic and intensely intimate. I love that a global conspiracy manifests as a family tragedy. It's a microcosm of the whole series.
Beautifully put. I couldn't have said it better. I don't think a lot of people could. That's, kudos. Very, very well put.
Just two more. So Edin Dumasic said, stunning two-parter, feels like a dry run for the movie. It's highly cinematic in scope and the story is leaning on the mythology, but it's actually rather self-contained. It's a perfect two-parter. He said, in the Quagmire X-Cast episode, you said, meaning me, that the episode feels just like the X-Files as a casual viewer would imagine the show. I agree, and I would say this two-parter fits the bill even more because of, all the little green men and flying saucers. And I'll just add, it looks stunning on Blu-ray. And yeah, I really would agree about the Blu-ray point. That's how I typically watch these days. And lots of stuff in this two-parter to relish on a visual level.
Yeah, well, I don't have a Blu-ray, but I have watched a lot of these things in HD. Online. And it's interesting because when I first watched the HD stuff, it was like watching it all over again because, you have like the depth of field. You see so much more of the background that really got lost in the lower resolution. So that just to me, just like one of the things that I love about the early, particularly the first season, and I think they kind of moved away from it when the show became more stylized, but I love how you really get a sense of the city. In the first season, that you really get a sense of like where this is taking place. And, obviously you're not going to get the same thing in this two-parter, but the way that they had really taken advantage of the incredible variety of landscape and location that they were offered, just in this tiny little strip of British Columbia, I think is beautifully rendered here. I mean, like, you would not think that this was all being shot within a few hundred acres. You know what I mean? It's like you really feel like you're going from, a location to location. And there's just a scope and a size here that, for all the all the globe trotting that we saw in the feature film, just didn't. I don't think it carried it off as well as you see here. So I mean, take that for what it's worth.
Just last one from Katie Doe, who said, I can watch this two-parter again and again. The scope of the story and the cinematography are fantastic, but there are also deep character moments as well. Mulder recounting what Max would have gone through along with the visuals is still chilling. And yeah, I think that's well said. All right, Chris, I guess we should leave it there for today. But yeah, good stuff, as ever. Been a pleasure. And yeah, so The Secret Son, people should check out, shouldn't they, if they want to know what you're up to these days. Mm-hmm. And I think we're in all the usual places. So on Twitter, at the X_Cast, Facebook group still going as well. So we'll be back next week with another episode. But until next time, always remember, trust no one.
The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_Cast, on Facebook by typing in the X-Cast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an X-Cast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music, and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.